I guess it was helpful to both be a scientist and to be able to deal with budgets and all HR issues. And I sort of liked it just because I always thought leadership gave you the opportunity to be a multiplier, to be able to not only do your own science, but help people in their careers and therefore multiply your impact. So that's sort of why I went into administration, really, just to help the next generation of people do good science, practice good medicine, and impact patient care. And so that's sort of why I went to administration. And I hope that it's what I was able to do in my leadership roles.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to another episode of our podcast. I'm speaking today with Dr. Paul Rothman. Paul is a distinguished rheumatologist and molecular immunologist, and something of a healthcare celebrity as the former dean of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and CEO of Johns Hopkins Medicine. He's still very active in working on that intersection of patient care, science, and medicine, and has been devoted to addressing racial and economic disparities in healthcare. Wow, Paul, that is a lot to unpack. Thanks for chatting with me today.
Well, thanks for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your audience today.
Yeah, so to kick things off, maybe could you share a bit more about your background, your journey in medicine, and what led you to become who you are today?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure most people will be bored, but I'll go through it quickly. I trained at MIT, Yale Medical School. People ask, why Yale? Well, I was a rower in college, and I could row, which I did through my years at Yale. And that's when I developed a love for immunology by a guy named Charlie Janeway, who was a very famous immunologist who was my mentor and advisor there. I went to New York City, to Columbia, to do my training, as you said, in medicine and rheumatology. Fast-tracked out to become a physician scientist, working with a guy named Fred Alt, who was at Columbia at the time and now been at Harvard probably for 30 years. Set up a lab at Columbia where I studied signal transduction and done by cytokines, also how antibodies were made, specifically IgE regulation. Then, even though I'm a rheumatologist, a guy named Mike Weitfeld asked me to become head of pulmonary allergy critical care, which I told him I didn't know any of that things, but he said, you'll figure it out. So I became head of pulmonary allergy critical care at Columbia, which was great. Worked with some lovely people, and I loved Columbia, but then had the opportunity to move to the University of Iowa in Iowa City. So I moved from New York City to Iowa City.
That's a big change.
Big change. Picked up my family, my 3 kids, the dog. Picked up a big van, moved across the country to a cornfield in Iowa City, Iowa, where we spent 8 years, first as chair of medicine, then as dean of the medical school there. Unlike a lot of people, even before Caitlin Clark, I loved Iowa City. It was a great place, great people, great medical center. We loved it there. And then in 2012, was asked to take this role as the dean CEO at Johns Hopkins Medicine, which I did for a decade. Then retired 2 years ago. So it's been a great ride. I'm semi-retired, living in Baltimore and Boulder, Colorado. So it's only live in places with bees in their name. So
I know that your semi-retirement really is semi, and you're still involved in so many things. I also know you have a few disclosures to share.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to tell us a bit about what you're doing today?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I always like to have my disclosure up front. So I'm on the board of Merck, which I've been on the board in my 9th year. I'm on the board of LabCorp. I'm on the boards of the King Faisal Health System in Saudi Arabia, the USC Health System, and I'm on the SAB of 2 small biotechs, one in Shanghai called Lakeshore and one in Boston called Cinelo. And I'm a consultant for 2 investment firms, RA Capital in Boston and Mingxing Growth Fund in Shanghai. So I do a lot of things, sort of see how I can help people out.
Well, that's a fascinating journey, Paul, and thank you for sharing. Maybe let's unpack that a little bit. So, I mean, you started your career practicing medicine, MIT, then in Columbia. Before you started to get into academics? What was the jump there, right? I mean, that's kind of a pretty dedicated career path for someone relatively early still in the journey to really move deeply into academia.
Yeah, well, I always knew I wanted to do science. I was, believe it or not, it was a AP biology teacher in high school who just got me to love biology. And I went to MIT to become a molecular biologist. It was just the beginning of molecular biology. For those who don't even remember this, it actually there was a hold on all molecular biology at the beginning of the field. And it began in Boston and out on the West Coast in San Francisco, Berkeley. And they actually put a hold on it because they didn't know the power and how one might harness it. It just resonates today with what we think about AI and just this new revolution that occurs occasionally. And so there was a technology revolution back in the 70s. And so MIT was a hub. I went there to become a biologist, studied DNA repair in E. coli, but wanted to just be closer to patients. So decided to go to medical school. And but never lost my love for science, which has been my driving force, as I said, since I was in high school, probably in 1974. So gosh, I sound old now, 50 years. So it's been a while. And I just thought that in medicine, you have the opportunity to take the science and the knowledge you're discovering and try to help patients. And that's what I've been trying to do now, I guess, for 50 years.
And then you added, though, another element, which is leadership and administration. So what drove you to be interested to be a CEO of a health system, in addition to your background as a doctor or as a scientist?
Yeah, no, it's a funny story. There were two of my mentors at Columbia, Kai Salicati and Len Chess. They said, Paul, you seem to like this stuff. We don't really like it very much. And we need people who are scientists to become academic leaders. So they put me up for all these positions and said, why don't you take it on? Because I guess it was helpful to both be a scientist and to be able to deal with budgets and all HR issues. And I sort of liked it just because I always thought leadership gave you the opportunity to be a multiplier, to be able to not only do your own science, but help people in their careers and therefore multiply your impact. So that's sort of why I went into administration, really, just to help the next generation of people do good science, practice good medicine, and impact patient care. And so that's sort of why I went to administration. And I hope that it's what I was able to do in my leadership roles.
It's interesting. That's quite a common theme of people that have spoken to me about that transition, right? Because a lot of doctors, to the point you made earlier with some of your mentors, like, oh, we hate doing that. That takes us away from what we love doing, which is hands-on patients and direct patient care. And yet there's others that are really attracted to it to say, it's actually a way to substantially multiply the impact and the reach that we can have as individuals, as leaders, and to make the system better. But it really does take, some gluttony for punishment, because there's a lot of hard work in kind of in the trenches of budgets and HR and politics and all these things that you mentioned that are non-trivial, but you must be very good at them if you did them at scale across multiple health systems like you have in your career.
Yeah, I think it's a very individual decision, right? And I know a lot of great administrators. I have a good friend, Mark Anderson in Chicago, he's a dean, CEO in Chicago, and still runs a big lab group. My hat goes off to him. You can still do science and do administration. Obviously, you have to limit it at some point, but it's just, how are you going to impact? When you look back on your life, you're still pretty young, but when you start of looking at retirement and try to look back at what you've been able to accomplish, any science I did and any science that is now in a textbook won't be in a textbook in 20 years from now. That's just, very few people have very, very long-term scientific impact because science moves forward, which is great. But if you're able to have that multiplier effect by helping the next generation and the next generation, you could still see what an impact that you've had on medicine for years to come. And I felt maybe I just wasn't sure I was a good enough scientist to have anything in a textbook in 40 years from now. So I made the decision that maybe I could be more helpful helping others than just trying to do my own science.
That's certainly a healthy dose of humility on that view. You mentioned a few individuals that you called out by name in your career. It sounds like mentors have played an important role in shaping your journey, right? From that high school AP math teacher, which my kids are in high school. I don't know that I know the name of their AP math or AP biology teacher. I'm curious to know if it's having an impact throughout a mentor you had at Columbia, and then people that convinced you to come back to Hopkins. And so what role do you think that in kind of in the vaunted career of someone like yourself, that mentors play, and maybe some to our listeners, how do they seek out those mentors that can help shape their career journey and take them to places maybe they couldn't have gone on their own?
Yeah, it's actually when my wife is also a physician. I met her while we trained at Columbia, and we look back, and I think mentorship is the key. I mean, if you think back, most professions and professionals have a component of mentorship in the profession. I mean, that is what professionals do. I fear that it's being lost now because many, certainly in medicine, the drive to produce more RVUs and do more and more with less time is driving people away from the time spent mentoring others. It's one of my biggest concerns about where medicine's going. It's this pressure that we all have to do more is taking away from the time, because mentorship is something you don't get paid for. It's we don't count it when we add up anyone's salary about, we don't grade them on their mentorship. So I think it's important, and it is a skill that we're very proud. At Hopkins, we actually had a group that mentored mentors to try to teach mentors how to be mentors. And my wife and I have felt so strongly. We actually have funded, endowed, and awarded Hopkins called the Dean's Distinguished Mentoring Award, where every year we recognize someone, a long-term faculty member at Hopkins who has mentored others and had this multiplier effect within Hopkins. And it comes out of a friend of mine, Darryl Grant, I did at Iowa. So I really feel very strong that almost all of us have had important mentors in their careers. And it's something that is under assault right now, to be quite frank, but it has been so essential to all of us, and it's something I sort of hope I still able to do. I am still able to do now, even in semi-retirement. So
I think that's a great call to action to our audience of thinking, who are the mentors in your life and how do you really deepen your relationship with them and, gain the most you can, and helping to, leverage their skills, their knowledge, their experience to shape your career, and also flip it back of who are you a mentor to and how do you build that mindset in your leadership journey of thinking about giving back as a mentor, giving back to other people who will kind of, stand on your shoulders when they leverage their career growth. So it's really great to hear that. And yeah, kudos to you and your wife for continuing that investment, that endowment, and just, in time and in capital to help drive more of that. Because I agree. I think generally as we move more towards also this kind of virtual environment, relationships change a little bit. I'm involved in a lot of CEO forums, Paul, and a lot of CEOs talk about the hybrid workplace and how are we adjusting to it and what are the challenges. And actually what I see, the biggest challenge to me is to young individuals that are starting out their career and need to establish learning in this kind of point-to-point relationship through Zoom or through Teams, versus like learning by osmosis, sitting next to your mentor and seeing how they are dealing with challenges, doing their day-to-day job, or dealing with a patient maybe in the context of healthcare. So I share that concern with you, and I think it's a very important part of what we can give back to the generations that come after us and will continue to shape the industry that we're in.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. And I will just say, one of the greatest moments I ever had was when I first became a scientist and I published my first paper in Science, and to be able to take a copy of that. In the old days, we used to get copies of manuscripts, when everything wasn't on electron, just being digitalized, and sent it to my MIT mentor, the guy whose lab I worked in as an undergrad, and thanked him for the mentoring he did for me. And I think you're right. The virtual environment is interesting. Through the pandemic, it was essential. It allowed us to do, I think, really important things for the country and the world. And yet the rewrite of the social contract that has come post-pandemic in terms of hybrid workplaces, I think it does some wonderful. Look, I work hybrid at RA Capital. I'm Zooming all the time to people around the country and world. So in some ways, it allows us to leverage expertise. And I'm sure you do this in your business in ways that we were never able before. On the other hand, I think it will have some impact on the ability for people to work together and to mentor young people. I think you're right. I think it will have the biggest effect on people who've not developed their careers yet and won't have that opportunity to spend time with people who over the long term would have had a large impact on their careers.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I want to come to another topic that I mentioned in my opening. I think you're really unique in where you sit of kind of this juncture of patient care and coming from a provider background, science as a scientist, and also medicine, biopharma. You are, advised and are involved in quite a few biotech ventures. It's really interesting to see that come together. And I think that generally our approach on the role that biopharma plays in our lives has really changed post-pandemic. I think in many ways, prior to the pandemic, we're somewhat conditioned through the media to biopharma is like the face of all evil. And now we're saying, well, actually they saved humanity in some level through this pandemic. And there are, very quick response to that and how the scientific community worked with the pharma industry very quickly to develop solutions to deal with global challenges. What's your perspective on that, on kind of this coming together of, science and medicine and pharma maybe into that mix?
Yeah, I think you said it very well. You know that when you look back, first of all, no one wants to think about the pandemic because it's very interesting. If we look historically to past pandemics, there are two responses. One of which is to try to forget it as quickly as you can. The other is to try to learn from it. And I worry that we're doing a lot of the former and very little of the latter because it was so stressful and traumatic to all of us that we're trying to put it behind us. There were some great lessons learned, and I think if you look back, I mean, you went 1 year from when that virus was first sequenced in Wuhan in December of 19 to having an effective vaccine. I mean, it's unbelievable. And then you look back and you had effective therapeutics, within another year. It's very remarkable. And it really did require coalescence of medicine, pharma, testing, public health experts to come to really get us out of a pandemic much quicker than we otherwise would have and save many lives. I don't know how many, but and I think it has brought us all closer. It also, I think, one of the interesting things, and I'm sure we'll get to this, I think it also demonstrated the importance of data. Mm-hmm. Because early on, if you remember the pandemic, there was so little good data coming out of about the virus. And actually at Hopkins, we're pretty proud. We were one of the first to actually stand up a center to provide the world with data. Laura Gardner did just a great job. There's a great story there. Laura Gardner, who did the Hopkins website, mm-hmm. She was an associate professor in engineering who studied traffic. And she and two graduate students said over weekends, we can provide better data than we're getting. And they got all these different streams of data together and set up the Hopkins website over a weekend.
I remember that as a consumer of that, of my kids would quote what the Hopkins data was showing about the progression, the survivability rate, and all these metrics that kind of came to light and were very much in the front and center for us as individuals, not as healthcare professionals.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. And Lauren Gardner did it. I mean, It just also tells you, what an impact that really 3 individuals could have. Obviously later on it got much more complicated, and I think we were stuck in many ways. But it did demonstrate how important data is, and how important the flow of data is, and how information can help us in ways that we didn't imagine. I think as we talk about how medicine's going to change and how science is going to change, I think we're all coalescing around the fact that being able to understand parse data is going to be so essential for us providing better care than we ever had. And that's what I think we're in the middle of. There's a great book by Alex Ross who talks about this fourth industrial revolution and how how disruptive it's going to be. And I think we're seeing that in many fields, but certainly medicine, I think, will have a huge impact on using AI, ML, and other data modules to better care for patients. And I think that's what we're in the middle of right now.
Mm-hmm. A lot of our audience, Paul, come from a medtech background, medtech entrepreneurs, different health tech or medtech companies. Is there a role also for medtech in all this, whether it's coming from the data side or stronger convergence maybe with biopharma, kind of this concept of a digital companion to a molecular therapy or to molecular test? Where do you see the role of medtech and devices into this?
Yeah. When at Hopkins, we had a great person, Anthony Rosen, who was our vice dean for research, and he sort of began our precision medicine initiative. And how he described it is it's all about measurement. That in fact, when we think about trying to understand a person's individual health, we do it by measuring things. And historically, we just really relied on blood tests and EKGs and then increased imaging. But in the world today, measurement is much more complex, much more thorough. And that's because of, as you described, all these medtech devices that are so important. And I think, the measurements, as we coalesce them together and then apply technology to understand how they interact to both measure and predict a person's health, is going to be essential. I'll tell you some anecdotes. So I have the Apple Watch, like everyone else. And this is a very story. And I was sitting at a meeting one day. This is pre-pandemic, and a strange feeling. And I didn't know quite what it was. And I thought my pulse was going a little fast. And I tapped my iWatch and I saw my heart was going at 179.
Wow.
And I had a tachyarrhythmia. And I knew exactly what it was. And I could see it. And I knew it wasn't a fib. I could tell you right now it was an SVT because I could see the strip on my iWatch and knew what type of arrhythmia I had, and talked to the guy sitting next to me. I said, well, maybe I should walk over to the ER. And it got controlled, and actually I got ablated. But and so it's just another way that a device personally helped me understand my own health. And I think, then after that, I had all these remote monitoring and just our ability to measure someone in their normal life. It's like blood pressure, right? But, where we could try to control someone's blood pressure, we had this one measurement when they came to visit us in the hospital, and that's what we used to understand how if we were controlling the blood pressure. Well, there's a thing called the white coat effect. Do you know this?
No.
So there's something called a white coat effect where, in fact, people's blood pressures rise about 20 milligrams when they come to their doctor because they're all anxious. And so there's this white coat effect, and so everyone's more hypertensive than we thought. And so now the ability to measure people's blood pressure during their whole day and during their normal life really helps us. Yeah, and just again, the instance, and diabetes is a great example of, constant continuous glucose monitoring and other things, just helping us better care for patients. So I think medtech is helping us measure people in multiple situations during their lives. It's going to be essential to really better people's health.
No, I really like the example you gave with ECG because I think it's interesting where it's applying a new measurement technology and miniaturizing it, right? You don't have to shave your chest and put a 12-lead ECG now. You've got a little thing on your wrist, but it's also that the AI there is really what allowed that to become FDA regulated, right? Because otherwise the FDA on all medical devices is worried about patient self-diagnosis. So you have to say, well, the AI is actually doing the monitoring and is providing more of a binary output to say, yes, no, is there atrial fib here or arrhythmia, right? As opposed to now just kind of burdening the system, which I think the system is worried about, of like patients now monitor everything and then they come back and there's a lot of false positives and maybe a lot of overburdening of concerns. That's an area, by the way, that even in imaging, we think the first breakthrough of the patient as the intended user of an imaging device would be based on AI, where the FDA might have a position that, well, if you're showing an image, I'm worried about patient self-diagnosing. But if the AI is stratifying the risk and saying, well, your interstitial lung fluid is going up, I'm worried about your congestive heart failure, that's a lot more accurate than palpating or standing on an electronic scale. And that, I think, could allow us to see a breakthrough where imaging also becomes more of this monitoring device. That's certainly where ultrasound could go.
Yeah, it's funny, and I know you work in this field that I take it. So I became crazy and been very convinced about how handheld ultrasounds are very accurate and and going to be the future of how we use it. And so, we had something called the stethoscope ceremony, where every year we would hand first-year medical students stethoscopes, and the alumni were very generous and donated all 120 students. And my last year, I got up and I would say, I don't know why I'm giving you this thing, because I kept mine for a stethoscope. They're good for 20 years before the rubber print. And so I'm sitting there. I said, I'm giving you this. You'll use it for a while, but eventually you're all going to have cheap handheld ultrasounds. And of course, some people yelled at me and it probably was an exaggeration. I still think there will be a stethoscope in 20 years, but, handhelds are going to, just be so widely used in the future. And that's good. I think that, it's all good. And I do think that the ability to both miniaturize technology and then, as you said, and it is going to be increasingly important to supply the patient with enough information to help them to understand what they're seeing on their devices, because otherwise it may overburden. It's the same way that, people are now able to access a lot of genetic information by either going to 23andMe or whatever, getting their whole genomes done. And there's a lot of information there that if we don't provide them with counseling and good information on what it really means, I think it's a problem. I'll give you a great example. So, you could get a polymorphism when you do your genome that says, you have double the risk of everyone else, or 100% more risk to get this disease than anyone else.
Right.
But, it's going from 1 in 2 million to 1 in a million, your chance of getting this disease. It's double your risk, but it's so rare that hopefully the patient won't stay up every night worrying they're going to get that rare disease, right? But if you don't understand it, it's a scary thing. So I think it's on us to try to ensure as patients get more of the information, which is going to happen, that we are able to better help them understand the data and action it.
And do you think AI could play a role there? A lot has been said.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, AI is the key. Well, AI, ML, I don't know what I get them mixed up sometimes because I think they're all intermixed, and a lot of people call things AI that aren't really AI, they're just really large language models or ML, machine learning. But I do think that that's the key to advancing medicine. Peter Lee has this great book out about how AI is going to change healthcare, and he had me become a believer. I really think it's going to revolutionize the field.
Mm-hmm. Here in imaging, AI has been around for a long time. It's also highly regulated, like different from a lot of the Gen AI models. FDA classifies imaging AI as software as a medical device, but it's really been focused on the provider. And I think we've established a view that this isn't going to replace the providers, kind of like, radiologists that use AI will replace radiologists that don't, as opposed to AI replacing radiologists. But kind of you're discussing maybe an interesting element of how can we leverage AI, not just for the provider, but actually to help the patient make sense of all the data that these devices and the broader kind of data community is throwing at us to make sure we can actually assess it and interpret it in the context of what it means to us as individuals and not, overburden the system or overweigh the risks that might be coming out of this or that test or this or that monitoring device.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be true. But, as you know, there are a great heterogeneity in patients. There are very savvy patients that are going to want to have more control over their own data, understand their own data, and action their own data. But I think most people are still going to rely on the providers. But for them, I think it's going to be easier because, we've all, as physicians, all had a patient who said, well, I got this result or that, or I saw this. And boy, the better informed a patient is, it's really going to be easier for the healthcare provider to help them understand the issues in front of them and try to understand what's the best decision for them. But there's also a cadre of patients that are really don't understand anything. And again, those are the patients that I think are essential for us to make sure that we make them understand. And I think, again, large language models can help us communicate with them more effectively and listen to them a little differently than we have in the past, and help them understand and help us understand their diseases too. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think And I think it's going to move pretty fast too.
Yeah, so you've laid a really interesting blueprint here on the convergence of science and medicine. We've discussed the role of data in all this and how AI can help us better interpret and action the data, both in the through the provider lens and through the patient lens. Maybe just as we start to bring our discussion today to a close, Paul, what other big drivers or disruptors or changes do you see that are kind of coming down the pipe from what you've looked at in your storied history, but also looking forward? You're involved in so many initiatives. What do you think is ahead of us?
I've been optimistic. I'll put a little pessimism on it too. I think in the United States, the cost of healthcare is becoming increasingly unmanageable. The biggest payer, the largest payer in this country for healthcare is federal government.
CMS.
And both CMS, VA, DOD, you add them all together, and it's over half the healthcare in the country.
Right.
And the country has $1 trillion a year deficit. So I think there's going to be tremendous pressure on bringing down costs. And I think a lot of what we're going to see are ways to bring down costs in healthcare. I think that's going to be a major driver. And it's also true, the large employers cannot absorb double-digit increases in the healthcare for people. And so I think the major driver, so you're going to have this either coalescence or conflict, but probably both, of technology and this unbelievable technology that we're bringing to bear on patients and a more constrained payer system where people and so what I think is going to be a major driver is trying to use technology to bring down the total cost of healthcare and make us more efficient. And I think that's going to be a major driver in how we develop over the next few years. And you can, and some of it's pretty, boring, allowing us to code our bills better. It's just stuff that it's going to be able to do. I hope it makes providers more efficient by using, natural language processing and other mechanisms to help us document. So the provider is spending 2 minutes documenting for every minute they have with a patient, which will allow the provider to do better healthcare. I think it's going to drive, more efficient and better imaging, hopefully better and more efficient development of drugs. So I think you have all that coming together. And so I think as you think about technology and where we're going, is to see how what we develop can make us better, get the patients healthier, at the same time bring down the total cost of healthcare in the United States. And I think that's going to be a major driver in addition to when we talk about consumerism, technology. And, the last thing that is interesting is, our ability to make important therapeutics, to develop, has never been greater. And, we have so many different platforms to develop therapeutics. It was always small molecule, then it was biologics. Now the biologics are in bispecifics and protags, and then you have cell-based therapies, and then you have gene therapy, genome editing. I mean, it's unbelievable. And hopefully we'll develop a system in the country where we look at the total value of a therapeutic and figure ways to ensure that we develop important therapeutics that, although the cost to develop them will come to a payer upfront, the total cost to the country is less. And so we figure some way that allows that payer to pay a lot upfront. I mean, the great example has been the Hep C therapeutics, right? Which
kinds of drug,
liver transplant was $150K. They priced it at, at $90K because it saved money, but no one wanted to pay $90K because the value did not come to the payer who's going to pay the $90K. And that's going to increasingly come with gene therapies and cell-based therapies. And we're going to have to figure a way to make sense of that and to make sure that we keep developing them, because long-term our health will improve, our long-term costs will come down, but how we pay for that in a way that makes sense to everyone is, I think, complex.
And maybe to just the point you made earlier on data plays an important role there of understanding the outcome data, right? So that you can amortize the expense towards an outcome. And that allows us to move away from where a lot of the cost resides right now, which is, principally we're married to this fee for service, right? You're kind of procedure based or drug based, and you're not actually measuring, well, what was the outcome of that? So
No, I agree.
a sobering perspective. And yeah, I thank you for also balancing the optimism with sobriety of what we're facing. But I think to your point, it's such an exciting time to be in healthcare, to be in medicine, to be in science, because we're just seeing so many more tests and therapeutics and outcomes improving. We are living longer, and yes, it's costing more, but you have to think there's a lot of smart people at the table here working towards that common goal of also access to care, which is a big issue, of course, tied to the cost of healthcare. Paul, I learned a lot today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure our listeners did as well. If they want to find out more about what you're doing or to follow you, where can they find out? Where can they follow you?
Well, I'm LinkedIn. Very happy to just, defend me. I have a bunch of folks on that. And other than that, I don't have other social media. Hopkins used to do that for me, but I'm semi-retired. So you can LinkedIn to me, and that's probably the best way.
Excellent. And again, I'm putting the emphasis on the semi, but truly, thank you for your time today, Paul. I really enjoyed this. I do hope to stay in touch. And to all of our listeners, that's all we're going to cover today, but please keep us in mind for the next episode of our podcast. That's a wrap. Bye-bye.